Good evening, everyone. My name is Carla Shedd. I'm Assistant Professor of Sociology and African American Studies here at Columbia University, and I am delighted to welcome you to our first talk in our conversation series here at the Institute for Research in African American Studies. We are delighted to welcome Dr. Crystal Marie Fleming to the stage today to talk about her work. She'll be giving a talk, Killing Them Softly, Anti-Blackness and the Legacies of Slavery in France. She is a Ph.D. from Harvard, did her undergrad at Wellesley in sociology as well. She wrote an award-winning dissertation upon which this talk and her forthcoming book is based. Her book will be out later this year on Temple University Press, so you have to look for it after you get this wonderful knowledge that she'll give us today. At the center of her work is a question about how a nation can officially frame itself as blind to race and also represent its racial past. She has done qualitative work around the Paris region to assess this question about how a variety of stakeholders, such as French politicians, activist groups, commemorative organizations, and members of the French Caribbean public interpret transatlantic slavery and race relations in France. She's interviewed over 100 activists, officials, and ordinary people. She's been a participant observer at cultural events, and she's analyzed the content of many political speeches to answer this amazing question. In a sense, she uses critical race theory to reveal the transatlantic slavery as inextricably linked to racial inequality in France, and explores how these politicians, activists, and common folks who are French descendants of slaves interpret this history and think about the legacy of slavery as well. This is an important project as we not only think about the boundaries of Blackness here domestically, but also how this works across the region. I'm delighted to welcome Crystal to the stage. Thank you for coming, everyone.
Thank you for being here. I did not know that I was the first person in the conversation series. Okay, for the semester. Okay, good. Well, thank you. Thank you for being here. Just before I launch into the talk, I kind of want to give you a sense of why I came to this project. I don't know if it's an amazing question, as Carla generously said, but I certainly, 10 years ago, got really curious about what French people, particularly French people of color, think about the history and legacies of slavery. Little bit about my background. I am an African-American person, U.S. slave ancestry. I have no family connection to the French Caribbean or to France, except my godmother. My godmother passed away a year ago. She was Haitian, and the only reason I even got interested in French is because when I was 9, she started to try to teach me French. I say try because I learned very little beyond comment allez-vous, but that at least taught 9-year-old me that there was something called French, and later I continued my studies and eventually did go to France. So I have no, familial connection to French Caribbeans, right? And I want to just draw a couple of distinctions because there's a great deal of difference between the experience of my godmother, who's Haitian, from an independent country, versus the people that I got interested in studying in France, who are Guadeloupean and Martinican migrants, who are born French. They have French nationality. About half of my sample grew up in the French Caribbean and then moved to mainland France. The other half grew up in mainland France. And so these folks don't have a separate national identity per se, although sometimes Guadeloupeans and Martinicans kind of feel like they do and assert that, and there certainly have been nationalist movements in both islands. But these are folks who are taught through the French educational system, through the French culture, that they are French. So that's a great deal of difference between them and my Haitian godmother. In any case, as an African American, I went to France for the first time in 2003. So this was a couple of years before the riots that have brought a lot more attention to contemporary racism in France. And so one day in my French class, this was a sociology of youth class that I was taking in a French university during my junior year abroad. And we were studying something related to crime and delinquents and sort of criminal justice in France. And I raised my hand, and in my broken French, I asked, is there any link to what we're studying and racism or race? And this older white gentleman, sociologist, professor, looked at me, I don't know, with like a mix of pity and like judgment in his eyes. He was like, this isn't America. We don't have these kinds of problems, he told me in the spring of 2003. And, so I'm feeling kind of embarrassed. I'm like 20 years old. I'm like, what do I know? And luckily, at the end of class, one of the only other black students in the class pulled me aside, and she said, we do have those kinds of problems. Just hang out with me, and we'll break it down for you. And that friend was from Cameroon, and her family basically adopted me during my junior year abroad, and gave me a whole different perspective on what it means to think about race in France than, of course, this French professor who denied that there was such a problem in France. I think in general it's gotten a lot more difficult to deny, the social reality of racism in France today, but the denial is still hegemonic. And so part of what I'm trying to do in my work is figure out how are people resisting French denials of racism, and what has the suppression of French history around colonialism, the French history of slavery, what does all that have to do with the difficulties of facing race and racism in France today? So what I did, and I'm going to tell you more about my project, was to go spend a little more than 2 years in the Paris region interviewing activists, cultural organizers, politicians, and folks who have been involved in trying to resurrect slavery or bring attention to the slavery past, to talk about colonialism. And then I also talked to a sample of French Caribbeans, so folks from Guadeloupe or Martinique, who could potentially identify as descendants of slaves, depending on how they think about themselves. And so I wanted to sort of compare how does the discourse, how do the claims being made by activists around what the history and legacies of slavery represent, how do these compare to what ordinary French descendants of slaves, so to speak, what they think? Are they saying the same things? Are there differences? And if so, what are those differences? So that's generally what the project is about. I hope the book will be out by the end of this year. I'm working on my final revisions. So with that said, if there are references or books or things that you think I should be reading or citing, don't tell me, because I have no time to do anything else. I'm kidding. Please do tell me. I have a little more time. I can squeeze something in. So yes, okay. So I want to first show a couple of pictures, and then I'll get into the substance of my talk. This is a photo that a friend of mine, her name is Jessica Louison, she took in October of last year. This was the Marche de la Dignité, the March of Dignity, that a lot of different groups, but especially French people of color, especially French women of color, and black women put together to bring attention to the difficulties faced by racialized minorities. That's the term that a lot of young activists are now using. The sign in the middle here says, La vie des Noirs compte. Does anyone here speak French? Do you know what it means? Of course you do. Of course you do. Yeah, Black Lives Matter in French. And you can't see this, but you probably can't, but there's another sign in the shadows there. And that sign says solidarity with victims of French bullets, okay? Because part of what people of color in France are trying to bring attention to is that it's not only minorities in America who get shot and killed for being a minority. And so one of the difficulties anti-racist mobilizations face in France is that the U.S. has like a pretty terrible international reputation for its racism. And very often that reputation is used to shut down French people of color and sort of say, like, you know, you got it pretty good. You're not getting shot as often as Black Americans are. What you complaining about? You know, you've got social safety net, this, that, and the other. And, you know, unwittingly, I think sometimes African-American activists, you know, in the zeal and in the passion to bring attention to what we face, sometimes, you know, use statistics in ways that make it difficult for people of color in Europe and in other places to sort of say, well, actually, us too, we are also marginalized, we are also victims of violence, and so on. This is a photo from my fieldwork. This is back in 2008. This is in the 17th arrondissement in Paris. This is the Place du Général Catroux. This was when they installed what, you know, I think you could tell is pretty obviously a set of chains that are broken, or shackles that are broken. This was to commemorate the abolition of slavery. And there I am when I used to have hair, more hair than I have now. I was a lot younger also, and that's the sculptor who designed it. And they had, you know, a big ceremony. There were French politicians who came, French Caribbean activists. Claude Ribes is a French Caribbean activist and writer who was at the initiative of this, along with other activists. Every year, there are ceremonies around the statute, as well as other sites of memory related to slavery that are popping up in Paris, and I'll explain why they're popping up in my talk. This is a photo from the interior of the Paris City Hall. This is another commemoration of the abolition of slavery. The crowd is mostly French Caribbeans, many of whom work for the city of Paris, so they didn't actually have to go to work that day, so they came to the ceremony. The day includes a lot of different opportunities for people to learn about the history of slavery, and also cultural performances, speeches, and so on. So this is a photo. Has anyone seen this? Okay. It says it's Paris Hilton, but this is actually not from Paris Hilton. This is a photo of French white police officers. I believe it came out, if not a year ago, then 2 years ago. And this was posted on one of their Facebook pages. They were having a jolly good time at their party, wearing blackface. And there were a series of photos. I don't have them all here, but you know, in addition to this, which has them in blackface, smiling in an exaggerated fashion and with some kind of afro wigs or what have you, I can't really tell. But there's another photo where one of them is scratching their armpit, and another photo where they have like a bowl of nuts and they're eating in a way that's supposed to look animal-like. This is not an isolated incident. There have been a number of other French white police officers who I don't understand why. First, I do understand why they do this. I don't understand why they think it's okay to post it on Facebook. But what happened is that they posted on Facebook like, oh, look, we had a good time. And then a French black activist saw this on their white friend's phone and was like, wait, what is this? And they sent it out to the news media, and a lot of people, you know, got up in arms, and there was, you know, some kind of reprimand made, or I'm not sure what its severity was, but it caused a controversy. I show this picture in order to, you know, just sort of make maybe an overly obvious point, which is that people who are involved in bringing attention to the history of slavery in France are not just doing it for shits and giggles. They are doing it in part, not entirely, but in part because of the persistence of anti-Black racism. And so part of what people in my field in sociology who study collective memory commemoration, part of what we do is to try and understand, what are the present day interests, concerns, and motivations that shape the way people interpret the past, that shape even people's desire to think about the past and to frame it in certain ways. And I'm particularly interested in how ideas about anti-Black racism and related forms of discrimination inform the motivation of activists to try to resurrect slavery, to resurrect colonialism, to talk about it, to make connections between the racial past and the present, which again is a particularly difficult thing to do in a country that frames itself as blind to race, as race neutral, right? So one of the concepts I'm going to talk about tonight, is racial temporality. That's the concept I develop in the book. And briefly, and I'll probably get into the details in a bit, but briefly I argue, this isn't rocket science, but I think being able to think about race temporally as something that extends through time, through processes, through group relations, is inextricably linked to the fight against racism. That is, unless we're able to make connections between present-day group relations and past forms of discrimination and racism, then we're not really going to be able to first understand our social situations, much less do anything to reduce racism. So I am definitely not the first person to make what is maybe on its face a pretty obvious point, but what I try to do with the concept of racial temporality is to highlight how so much of the literature on race in France kind of ignores some of these dynamics and certainly ignores critical race theory, which I'll talk about in a bit. The last photo I want to show before I get into the talk. This is from a 2009 protest in the streets of Paris. That year, that spring, there were uprisings in overseas France, in Réunion, in the Indian Ocean, in the French Caribbean, Guadeloupe, Martinique, and other places in Guyane. Why? Because, as you may recall, 2009, economic crisis. And so in these French overseas departments and territories, the price of everything was skyrocketing. And so just the price of being able to get, a loaf of bread or eggs or just provide, for the basics for your family was just getting insane. And so people banded together. They went on strikes. I think it was the longest general strike in recent history in the French Caribbean. And so in Paris, there were also marches in solidarity. I show pictures of two of these signs because they relate to this idea of racial temporality that I'm going to be talking about today. On the left, there's a banner that says Guyane with the Antilles, with the French Caribbean, the same combat today. The chains are, les chaînes sont dans nos têtes, the chains are in our head. They're not on our feet. Go to the end. So, keep going. In other words, today, the chains of slavery are not binding us physically. They are binding us psychologically. Okay? So there's an argument there about the impact of slavery on the present. Sign on the right, 1492, 2009, and then in Creole, profitation or exploitation. So there's an effort here to draw connections between 1492 and 2009, more generally the history of French colonialism and slavery, and the exploitation that these protesters felt they were still subject to. In other words, the imaginative connection to a history of oppression. That's part of what I'm interested in in looking at this concept of racial temporality. So please pardon my voice. I'm not feeling at my best, but hopefully you will be able to mostly follow me. So for most of the French, 1998 is remembered as the year that their team won a stunning 3-0 victory over Brazil for the World Cup Championships. The diverse team, which included Zinedine Zidane and Liliane Thuram, popular players with ties to former French colonies, was widely represented in the media as a triumph of French multiculturalism. The phrase La France black, blanc, beurre, France black, white, and maghrébin, or Arab, became a ubiquitous phrase in coverage of the event. The uplifting framing of the World Cup victory and its symbolism of multicultural solidarity eclipsed a far more troublesome development that year in 1998. That year happened to be the 150th anniversary of the second abolition of slavery in the French overseas territories. France has the dubious distinction of being the only country that abolished slavery twice. So they actually abolished it around the time of the French Revolution. And then they re-enslaved people that they had freed. Napoleon played a big role in that. Those of you who know the history of the Haitian Revolution know that that attempt at re-enslavement has a lot to do with why Haitians, or those who became Haitian, revolted. So 1998 was the 150th anniversary of this second abolition, which took place in 1848. To mark the occasion, the French government planned a series of official events over the course of the year, both in mainland France as well as the overseas departments where slavery took place. This decision stood in marked contrast to the 100th anniversary of the second abolition, which passed without much fanfare in 1948. For the 150th anniversary, an interministerial office was established under the leadership of Guadeloupean writer Daniel Maximin to organize a series of commemorative events. In mainland France, they included, among other things, an exposition that they called Unchain Your Citizenship that attracted 55,000 primary school students. The National Assembly opened its doors on April 25th of that year for a musical festival and a display of documents and artifacts related to abolition. And this last bit is key, the emphasis on abolition, because for so many French white politicians, the impetus in recognizing the slavery past was to focus on abolition, right, rather than what happened before abolition. In other words, the process and persistence of slavery itself, as well as the failure of that first abolition. So in other words, what happened in 1998 and what activists, particularly from the French Caribbean, but also folks of African immigrant origin, what they protested was this reduction of slavery, the commemoration of slavery, to just being about abolition. Is that actually, we had ancestors, or we had, people who we identify with who were enslaved and who matter and need to be a part of what's remembered. So the slogan that accompanied the government's official commemorative events was, "We were all born in 1848." Right, the year of the second abolition. We were all born in 1848. And this was meant to, convey this narrative of inclusion, of everyone sort of being the same, and of 1848 representing the real France, the real French Republic, right? The republic that was responsible for abolition, right? Something to celebrate and apparently feel good about. So this, in the minds of a number of activists, this phrase, "we were all born in 1848, represented erasure, right? Erasure of the enslaved themselves, of the fact that people actually existed prior to 1848. One activist told me during an interview years after this, they said, the Socialist Party that was in power at the time recognized that they had actually made a small mistake. Because in 1998, at the time of the 150th anniversary of the abolition of slavery, they said we were all born in 1848, therefore born at the moment of abolition. That is to say that before abolition, nothing happened. And he goes on to say there was a big reaction against this, and that's why we marched. So what happened in 1998 wasn't just that the French government organized this somewhat awkwardly handled commemoration of abolition, but what happened was a counter mobilization on the part of people of color in France who said, hold up, we have a different representation of this history, one that includes us, one that includes collective identities that resonate with us. And what happened is that in 1998, there was the largest march of Afro-descended people and people who identify as Black that had been in the streets of Paris. It didn't attract that much attention, but it would prove, in retrospect, to be a kind of tipping point. Because a few years later, after 1998, you had the 2001 Taubira law. It was named for Christiane Taubira, who just resigned. You may know she was the first Black Minister of Justice in France. And she just resigned over the permanent state of emergency, as well as some of the political issues that have to do with the response to the terror attack of the fall. In any case, she resigned in protest. But in 2001, there was a law passed with her name because she played a large role in it, working with other people, including a lot of activists on the ground. And that law, the 2001 Taubira law, made France the first and only country in the world to say officially that the transatlantic slave trade was a crime against humanity. This was the 2001 Taubira law. And what happened in between 1998 and 2001, between the anniversary of the second abolition of slavery and that a big march of Afro-descendant people and the passage of that law, was the beginning of a modern commemorative social movement that is continuing into this day. Not that there has ever been a point where people of African descent in France, forgot colonialism or slavery. There have been commemorative activities and movements, if you will, that predate this. But the contemporary moment is really rooted in what happened between 1998 and 2001. France is now the only country in the world, to my knowledge, that has a National Day of Memory dedicated to the history of slavery. It's May 10th. And so throughout the country, in principle, on May 10th, there are events, cultural events, educational events related to slavery and colonialism. More slavery than colonialism, bizarrely, but that's something maybe we can talk about in the Q&A. And there are actually multiple dates. Because the French overseas departments and territories received the abolitionary decree at different dates, because the boat arrived literally on different dates. So each department, each overseas department where slavery took place, has its own day dedicated to commemorating abolition. And so when migrants from Guadeloupe or from Réunion or Martinique arrive in mainland France, they come also not just cognizant of May 10th as the new day to celebrate, or rather to remember the history of slavery, they also have their own individual dates. And so what's happened in mainland France has been some struggle over which dates to continue remembering. But the point I want to underscore here is that there are multiple dates in France to set aside time to think about the history and legacies of transatlantic slavery, multiple dates. and one of them is nationally recognized. So I got fascinated, with the question of why were people doing this? Why at this moment did people, activists, latch on to slavery as something to commemorate, to resurrect? And this, for me, as a sociologist of race, was the thing that I was especially interested in. To what extent did these activists and officials involved in bringing attention to slavery, to what extent did they connect this history to concepts of race? Right? To what extent did they racialize slavery? Now, the idea that, you could talk about transatlantic slavery in a way that's kind of distancing yourself from race or that's quasi-race neutral might seem bizarre for a U.S. audience. But in France, there is an unusual aspect of the political opportunity structure that actually leaves room for French descendants of slaves to resurrect slavery, bring attention to the slavery past in ways that distance themselves from Blackness. And for me as an African American, that's the thing that when I read about this before I went to France to study it, I was like, what in the world? What is going on? How is it and why is it that there are organizations, French Caribbean organizations, that are saying we need to remember slavery, we need to talk about it, we need to look at how it impacts the present, but don't call us Black. In other words, this is not, for some French Caribbean organizations, this is not Black history. It's French Caribbean history, or it's the history of the overseas. Now, this difference in the association of Blackness with being a descendant of slaves, in any case, the opportunity in France to distance yourself from Blackness while embracing the history of slavery, this is a particular difference with regard to the United States. And I say this also because there's a really compelling and important book that I recommend that I'm working my way through. Michelle Wright has a book called The Physics of Blackness. It came out last year. That really attempts to think about Blackness in a way that centers temporality. So Michelle Wright argues that Blackness is not so much a what, it's a when. And in the United States, the when that is kind of the crucible for Blackness is very often what she calls a middle passage epistemology, right? The idea that one is only really Black if you have U.S. slave ancestry, like I do. Right? So I'm a real Black, according to the definition. And in her analysis, part of what she does is argue that, she critiques this middle passage epistemology, and she looks at examples of different kinds of Black identities that become marginalized by the middle passage epistemology. Of course, maybe one you could think of is Barack Obama. People were like, is he really Black? But she goes beyond that to argue that, Black queer identities, Black female identities, and so on, have also been marginalized by aspects of, rigidly identifying Blackness with the middle passage experience. And also with sort of thinking about Blackness in a linear way, as rooted in transatlantic slavery, and perpetuated or related in a fundamental way to the contemporary experience of anti-Black racism. So my understanding, although I confess I'm not done with the book, it is challenging, but my understanding of Michelle Wright's argument is not that one should completely get rid of any ideas related to this middle passage epistemology, but certainly she encourages a rethinking of it, a challenging of it, and a deconstruction of it. And I share a number of her concerns, and especially her effort to think about Blackness in a way that centers our ideas about time and temporality. But in some ways, my project is kind of the opposite of deconstructing the Middle Passage epistemology, although there certainly is some overlap too in sort of challenging it. But partly what I argue throughout the whole book is that it's a problem that it's so difficult in France to draw attention to the connections between the history of slavery and colonialism and present-day anti-Black racism. That it's actually a really, really, really big problem. Right? And Michelle Wright recognizes that, for a lot of activists and scholars, who are concerned with anti-Black racism, there is this effort to again and again show, well, this is the impact of slavery and colonialism on the present, and we should be concerned with it because it has, basically the effect of racism. And she doesn't deny that. Where I try to intervene in my work is to say, the French are so far behind in producing just very basic knowledge about race and racism in their society that, for us, something that may seem passé, just simply acknowledging that the slavery past has a deleterious effect on the present, that this is actually kind of where a lot of the work is in France, just really contesting the erasure that's happening in the educational system that doesn't teach about the history of colonialism and slavery. There's nothing, even approaching what we have as Black History Month. Not that Black History Month is, perfect or anything. It's just a month, right? It's ridiculous. The whole rest of the year is White History Year. But, in France, in 2012, they attempted to have the first official Black History Month. It was actually put on by some educators and activists. It wasn't sort of embraced by the nation. But to my understanding, it hasn't lasted. There, again, are a number of reasons why it's very difficult to make these sort of basic connections between the racial past and present. How are we doing with time? About 10 minutes. Now I got another hour and a half left in this lecture. Okay. And so what are a couple of the things I want to make sure I say? Well, one is, and I promise I will actually show you some empirical data, but I want to tell you a bit about my frustrations with the literature on race in France. Okay, there are a few, actually, I guess I do have a slide, my beef with the literature, yes. Okay, the first one is, I won't spend much time on it, it's simply the fact that scholarship on race in France remains anemic. There's a growing body of literature, but especially in France, there has been almost no institutionalization of studies related to race. There are not departments dedicated to it. I think there was an attempt at one department that included racial analysis along with gender, sort of officially in its name. But there's nothing like Black studies, not only in France, but in Europe. There's not a strong institutionalized thing that one could call Black European studies even though there are people who are working on these issues increasingly. Okay, so that's one thing. Okay, fine. Really, it's the second point that drives me crazy. That is that over the last 30 years, there's emerged, a body of scholarship that's attempting to talk about race in France and look at patterns of racism in France. But one of the curious features of this literature is that it tends to minimize anti-Blackness. In other words, in some of the dominant, most influential scholarship on race in France, what do they argue? They argue that the group that's really discriminated against the most are the Maghrébins. And that France, yes, there's anti-Black racism, but it's not that bad. So there are all these ways that I critique in the book that various influential scholars have perpetuated the notion that anti-Black racism isn't so bad in France. And by the way, African Americans have played a role and continue to play a role in perpetuating this crazy. I was actually a little surprised. I don't know if I should have been surprised, but I came across a quote from W.B. Du Bois. I think he wrote it in 1919, and it was something like, to paraphrase, it was like, what a glorious thing to be a Black Frenchman in Paris. Because, again, there has been, for quite some time now, an African-American expat community that has fled they have had the real experience of fleeing racism in the United States and feeling and being relatively well-treated in France. Now, part of what the selective nice treatment that African Americans get, part of what that actually is related to is discrimination against Black French people. In other words, for many white French people, African Americans have nothing to do with their colonial African savages. They draw a distinction in their minds very often, a kind of exceptionalism, whereby African Americans aren't their Blacks. And so there is, again, in the political opportunity structure in France, there is the opportunity for African Americans to go and be treated, in ways that, first of all, probably have never been treated before in the U.S. context, and then to misread that treatment as, evidence that, oh my gosh, it's so fantastic to be Black in France, when really it's relatively fantastic to be African American in France. It's not so great at all to be Black French. And of course, that depends also, there are different positions and experiences within the Black French experience that are more privileged than others. But by this, I just want to point out that African Americans, have played a role in perpetuating the minimization of anti-Blackness in France. There has been really compelling and important research in the last 15, 20 years that does include the experiences of Black French populations. And this literature is very, very important, and the Q&A, maybe we could talk more about it. But one of the limitations of this literature is almost none of it engages with critical race theory. In other words, we have a number of studies that look at processes of racialization, that look at anti-Black racism, that even look at white racism, but do not look at the concepts of white supremacy and white supremacist oppression as things that actually still exist in France. And I argue, along with other scholars who are influenced by critical race and systematic race approaches, that if we don't connect anti-Blackness and anti-Black racism to the concept of white supremacy and to the practice of white supremacy in France and elsewhere, that we unwittingly risk reinforcing white supremacy. So a number of scholars, not the least of which includes Charles Mills, the critical race philosopher, have argued that white supremacy, that is the sociopolitical dominance of people socially defined as white, right, which came out of the aftermath of European colonial expansion, that white supremacy requires, for its continuance, its obfuscation, its minimization, right? Its denial in some cases. So Charles Mills argues that white supremacy involves an epistemology of ignorance, right? Cognitive dysfunctions that misrepresent the racial situation in any given society that's still marked by white supremacy. So in other words, a kind of a cognitive misrepresentation or dysfunction related to white supremacy that sustains it is to say that there's no such thing as race, right? Or to deny that whites have privileges, that whiteness involves systematic privileges, okay? And so part of what I do in the book is look at how French politicians, particularly, perpetuate these epistemologies of ignorance. So I look at how in over 200 political speeches over the last 30 years, French white politicians talk about the history of slavery, especially to say that France was great for abolishing it, but they do so in ways that mask whiteness. In other words, they blackwash slavery. So slavery becomes a thing that involved Negroes, nègres, people of color, but there was no white people involved. So the racialization of the enslavers is rendered invisible. Now, thankfully, French politicians aren't the only ones talking about slavery. So what I do is also attend, I did, in any case, I attended commemorative events, and what I show is that on the ground, particularly when people of color are involved in organizing events, holding Q&As, expositions, film viewings, that in those forums, people do construct and refer to whiteness, both past and present. In other words, the racial temporalities that are produced on the ground away from and oftentimes in resistance to the white supremacist denial in the political speech, that work on the ground is doing the hard labor of making connections between the racial past and present, and also acknowledging whiteness as part of that racial present. And I show that that's actually a pretty difficult thing for folks to do. So I know I've got like 30 seconds, so I want to show you, yeah, you already know, France is still a white supremacist society, take my word for it. Maybe one thing I will say before I show the empirical results, because this is kind of important, and I think a lot of folks who aren't familiar with France may not be aware of this. So I identify 3 characteristics of French white supremacy, right? Because French, I'm following the work of folks like Charles Mills and others, like Melissa Weiner, who's a critical race sociologist, who look at white supremacy as a global phenomenon. Okay, fine. But that doesn't mean that it manifests exactly the same way in every society. So French white supremacy, aside from the fact that people informally defined and recognized as white hold sociopolitical dominance, it has 3 characteristics that I identify. One is the hegemony of colorblindness. Right? Now, we have colorblind ideology and denial in the United States, but it's not as hegemonic as it is in France. In other words, imagine if, you know, all the folks, particularly like the conservatives who say, oh, yeah, we shouldn't have ethnic studies, you know, that's creating racial divisions. There's no race in America, that we're post-racial. Imagine if that was the official policy of the nation, right? That's the French situation. So colorblindness is hegemonic, which means resisting that, naming race, talking about it, is far more politically risky in France than it is here. A second feature of French white supremacy, and this is a strange term, but it's something called anti-communitarianism. So in French, to be called communitariste is not good. To be communitariste essentially is to be stigmatized as divisive, right? And minorities in particular are stigmatized as communitariste or divisive when they bring attention to their group membership, their collective identities, their group politics in the public sphere, right? Because they're told, you should just be French in the public sphere. You should not put your racial or gender or sexual identity first, right? Your Frenchness should come first, okay? And certain groups, minority groups, are more stigmatized than others. Black folks, people who identify as black, are particularly stigmatized and punished when they put their blackness first or when they emphasize their blackness. Third, and this is connected to the other 2, third feature of French white supremacy is anti-racialism, right? And this is also a feature of white supremacy in the Netherlands and some other countries. Melissa Weiner talks about anti-racialism in the Netherlands, and essentially, anti-racialism argues that to talk about race, to use racial categories, is racist, right? Yeah, so it's certainly, France doesn't have a monopoly on it, but I just want to point out these are 3 features of French white supremacy. Okay, let me show you a few empirical slides. So, You know that I talked to a bunch of activists and folks about why they were bringing attention to slavery, but I also wanted to get the perspectives of ordinary, non-activist French Caribbeans. So one of the questions I asked toward the end of the interview, this is after we've talked about a whole lot of other things. We've talked about their identities, their migration experiences, their perspectives on racism, whether they think it exists or not, and so on and so forth. Towards the end, I asked some questions about what they think about the history and legacies of slavery. So this question, do you think that there are still consequences or traces of the history of slavery? Okay, so what this shows is that there were, first of all, the vast majority of my respondents said yes, only 3 of them. This is out of like 59 people, only 3 said no, there's no traces of slavery. Everyone else was like, yes, there are traces of slavery. And these are the main arguments that they used to say that slavery had consequences in the present was to say that it affected economics and the political structure. Some thought that it explained intergroup relations. And some also thought that it explained the functioning within the group. In other words, why French Caribbeans act the way they do. And as you can imagine, for just about all of these, which were basically evenly distributed, basically they thought the legacies were negative. Okay, it's not like they thought, not like most people thought, oh yeah, slavery had these wonderful effects. Although certain commemorative organizations like UNESCO, with their Slave Route project, have tried to not so much talk about the positive impact of slavery, but to show, well, you know, we have, you know, a lot of cultural diversity, you know, that has come, and to not just have a catastrophic image. Okay. Now, this is where things get interesting, because, okay, they think that slavery certainly affects the present, but where? I know this is hard to read, but what this graph shows is that most of my respondents thought that the legacies of slavery were located in the French Caribbean. In other words, they did not see slavery and colonialism, and they differed to the extent that they connected the two, but they did not see it as highly consequential for mainland France. So when I asked them, okay, well, what are the legacies of slavery? They talked about economic and structural issues, but in Guadeloupe and Martinique. They talked about the fact that white folks, descendants of colonists, who they called the Béquets, that they continue to own the land and that they have the wealth in the French Caribbean. But the vast majority of the French Caribbeans I interviewed did not say, oh, well, the racism that I experienced, and because most of them did, first of all, identify as black or categorize themselves as black in addition to being Guadeloupean, Martinican, or whatever. They self-categorized as black. They talked about racism. They were not in denial of its existence. But when I asked, what are the consequences of slavery, very few of them connected their experiences of anti-Blackness, or what I would label anti-Blackness, they didn't connect that to slavery and colonialism in mainland France. So to conclude, and maybe in the Q&A I can, you know, there's one quote in particular, maybe I'll just share it now. Yeah, there was this first-generation migrant named Pierre from Guadeloupe, and, you know, he talked about this last category of sort of the intra-group consequences of slavery, the functioning of French Caribbeans themselves. And I just want to share with you this short quote of what he said. So he said, the heritage or the legacy of the wound, it's what they told us all the time, that we're shit, that we're savages, we're from Africa. The only value we could have was in serving the master, and so your masters are the whites. It's a black wasn't going to heaven unless he respected his master. That's where his hierarchy among blacks come from with regards to skin color. So here he's talking about colorism. And so this importance of having white blood, you see what I'm saying? It's the importance of having white blood and all that. That's a mark. That's a mark of slavery. It's a wound. So this kind of analysis, which we could think of also as kind of a Fanonian analysis of internalized oppression, I think this is not unusual for people who are descendants of slaves to essentially locate the negative impact of slavery on their own behavior or on members of their group. And in closing, one of the things that I'm particularly concerned about is the tendency of descendants of slaves to view themselves or ourselves as wounded by slavery without also simultaneously understanding the structural and systematic sources of that wounding. In other words, what's the consequence? What is the potential impact of viewing yourself as a wounded descendant of slaves if you do not also see clearly that that wound is connected to systematic and structural racism?
So I've got lots of questions, but I'll just ask two.
This is a microphone.
Alors, merci beaucoup. Really interesting conversation. So, I'm an American, Black. I love America. I love France as well.
You love America.
I do love America.
I don't hear that often.
I know,
Okay.
it's kind of sad, actually. That's a whole another conversation. Yeah, so one thing that I don't like that I see in France oftentimes is that there is this, I think, particularly among young people, young French folks, this sort of, they have this notion of America as being, apart from people getting shot or whatever, there is, America is to be emulated. It is, the pinnacle, right? And I'm sort of concerned. I mean, there's things I like about France, especially from the standpoint of how people sort of get together, whites and blacks. It could be totally anecdotal, but I get a feeling that despite the downsides, there is a certain sort of, the colorblindness does work in some regard. I don't know if I'm wrong for that. And so I'm wondering, and I hear often from French people, from young French people that come to the States, they first learn of their blackness through an American lens or through an American education, right? And I sort of wonder, I don't know if America is to be emulated necessarily, or if the racial identity is to be emulated. Does that make sense? What I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so I just wonder if that is an issue, or if there's a Frencher model for the evolution of this consciousness. Yeah.
Well, thank you for your questions. Maybe to start with the last part, I definitely don't think France is the country to look to for an evolution of racial consciousness. I will say, because in part, they're so used to thinking that. They're so used to drinking their own Kool-Aid. When I was last in Paris, a few weeks before the terror attack in the fall, I was at a conference and I had like this pretty intense debate with a number of people, which is not unusual, but there was one white French scholar who was telling me, well, at least here, France, we have more intermarriage, between whites and minorities. And I said, and that's almost more depressing. You will marry people of color and still fuck them over and still perpetuate racism. And I said it like that, And I think I banged my hand on the table because I'm not, at this point in thinking about these issues, I don't get too much out of thinking, comparatively which place is better for racism. And I think Fanon had, a really great, argument against engaging in that kind of comparative analysis. Which place, is a better racial hell, to paraphrase. But I did, when I started my research, I was curious. I was like, well, what do these people think about what it's like to be Black in the United States? So I asked, at the end of the interview, asked them a number of questions about what they thought about African Americans. And I also asked them, because this was at the height, I did these interviews while Obama was rising, all that hope. And I was caught up in it too. I was part of the Democrats Abroad organization. I was going on French TV and drinking Obama's Kool-Aid. I think they thought I knew him. They'd be like, they treated me like an emissary. Anyway. So anywho, I asked, do you think it's better to be Black in France or in the United States? And I haven't published this yet, but after this book is done, I will publish this. But first of all, I don't think French Black people get enough credit for how savvy they are. They think about race globally far more than the average African American, in part because their own families often involve migration. A lot of Black French people have a transnational experience, so they have a transnational lens. And, most of the people I interviewed did not say that one was better than the other. Basically they thought, it's kind of shitty everywhere. It's like, different shit, different country. But anti-Blackness isn't great anywhere. Now, some did talk about, they're like, well, if I go to America, I might actually get shot for being Black. And so maybe I prefer to be here. There's an image of America as being, and I don't think it's, I think we can understand why this image exists, but there's an image of America being more violent, more racially violent, where you might get lynched, you might get shot for being Black. Not that doesn't happen in France, but there's a perception, and I think one that is linked to an empirical reality, that, your risk of dying while Black is elevated in the United States for various reasons. And a lot of French people and French people of color, they watch a lot of our movies. If you go to, and I will pause here because I know there must be other questions, but you go to the Fnac in France, I don't know even what's the equivalent to the Fnac? Best Buy? Something like that? Okay, so they have tons of books, DVDs, and all this. There is an African American section in the French equivalent of Best Buy for films. There is no Black French section. So all that to say, they grew up watching, probably more Black American movies than I've seen. So they're not just making up ideas. The French Caribbean is right next door. So some folks, they come to the United States because it's not that far from Martinique or Guadeloupe. So I think they're very savvy. I don't find that there's, just like universal naivete. Is it true, though, that a lot of, French people of color maybe, come to question color blindness in a new way after coming to the U.S.? Yes, I've seen that, too. And I think, also the reverse is true. I've had, in doing these interviews, the French Caribbeans almost drove me crazy. French people in general almost drove me crazy, thinking about race and getting into all the permutations of what it means to transcend race in France. But I would say, just to close, that I don't think it's rosy. I think you do have more intermarriage, for example, but I think that also poses particular challenges. And we've seen throughout the world that just because you have ethnic or racial mixture, that has never been a solution to eradicating white supremacy. And in fact, sometimes that's actually part of how it's maintained.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk. Thank you. The 2001 law declaring the transatlantic slave trade as a crime against humanity, did that come out of the 2001 Durban Conference on Racism?
It's connected,
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
just wondering. Just recently, I was speaking to a British Caribbean woman, and she was getting very upset about the fact that people here call her Black, and I mean, the more we talked, the more upset she got about it. She said, "Don't ever call me Black. I hate people calling me Black." And, it's similar, I guess, to the French Caribbean.
Yeah.
It's the British Caribbean. What do you think of Ta-Nehisi Coates' family moving to Paris? Partly what he said is because of the safety of his teenage son.
Yeah, I mean, so do we know, has he moved permanently? Has he left the United States? Or is it just temporary? He'd be back sometime? Okay. Ta-Nehisi Coates? Okay, okay. Well, I don't know him personally or his family. I would just say that, from my dear, dear friends who have left the United States and made a life, I'm talking about black people. I have non-black friends too, but now I'm talking about the black ones, who have left the United States and moved permanently to France. It is real, the difference in the life that they experience. I have long discussions because I study French racism, right? So I'm continually thinking about the downside. But my African American expat friends who've moved permanently to France, they try to convince me that it really objectively is better. And part of what I have seen, no judgment, okay, a little judgment, even of my friends, is that perception of it being so much better really does require living in a bubble that does not include a whole lot of contact with French black people. Because in my experience, even when I am in France, and I have to say sort of, socially and materially, I don't even know how my social capital counts for maybe like 50 times more than it does in the United States and France. It's kind of crazy. But because of the nature of my work and my social milieu, I'm constantly in contact with black French people who are, taking shit and experiencing real oppression. And so that affects my capacity to have a great time in France. So I think that if you are an African American, not talking about Ta-Nehisi Coates in particular, but if you are an African American who, wants to live what subjectively feels like a better life for you, then, there's room for you to do that in France. There's also some room for you to do that here. We have a word for those kinds of black people. And we also see that, it's kind of it's not the same, but it's a similar dynamic whereby people like the Black Caribbean that you mentioned and other folks come here, and it's not just that they don't want to be recognized as black. First of all, it's partly because it's not so great to be recognized, it's not so great to experience a type like racism, but also because there's a cachet for not being African American, right? That middle passage black. And there's certainly a cachet in France for being African American and not being, a French colonial subject black.
Because I have a teenage son.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the struggle is real. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Fleming, for this talk. You mentioned your concept of racial temporality, and you sort of just hit on this a minute ago when you said that some blacks can live in a bubble. But can you talk about the kind of spatial dynamics of race? We know, the racialized minorities don't live in the city center of Paris. They live in the suburbs. And how do they sort of, how do we erect these kind of spatial boundaries, either speaking from, the Black French and how they sort of navigate them? How do they cross them, perhaps? Or how might we think of the maintenance of these racialized borders, either physically or perhaps, proximal kind of borders?
Yeah, I mean, well, you hit the nail on the head in terms of residential segregation and racial segregation and ethnic segregation in France. That is certainly, I did my research based in the Paris region. Most of my folks didn't live in the center of Paris, although some of my respondents did, but these are folks who lived in the suburbs and didn't have that many white neighbors. What your question made me think of, and that I don't talk enough about in the book, are some other spatial dynamics that are really chilling and crazy, but also, understandable given white supremacist domination in France. So going to the issue of commemoration, where are these sort of official events and statutes and things going up? Not to say there aren't events in the suburbs, because there certainly are. But the picture that I showed earlier of the chains, the big statue and the broken chain, that's in one of the, wealthiest neighborhoods in Paris where there are not many minorities. A number of the commemorative events that are, officially organized by either the French state or local officials, they are invitation only, and, the president is there. And as an African-American researcher with certain credentials, I can easily get an invitation. Regular French descendants of slaves cannot all get on the list, and, very few do who aren't, of a certain economic background. So there are all these ways in which the commemoration of slavery itself segregates and excludes people of color for whom the history, has a special significance.
Thank you so much for your lecture. I was just passing by and saw your ad and ran on over. My experience is that I'm an African American who grew up in Harlem, and my parents were very old when they had me. My father was 64, so guys. My parents decided to send me to the Lycée Français in Manhattan because they were worried that if racism got too bad in the United States, at least I would be able to go to France like W.E. Du Bois and all the other French authors and singers and artists that lived in France, sort of easy and enjoyed it. And they talked about how, it's just the beautiful life and food and people and everything.
The food is good.
Yes, the food is
good.
Miraculous, right? But in any case, going to the lycée, I was the only African American. I was the only American with two parents American. And so there were difficulties, but my mother, mandated that I would graduate from the lycée, and I did. I have my baccalaureate and everything. But a few years after graduation, I started medical school in France. And one thing that had really, and this is just one anecdote, bothered me was that you came to school in the centre-ville, you came to school there, but you had to be out of the town by 8 o'clock because the buses that took the kids back to their dorms stopped at 8 p.m. And so even if it was 10 p.m., I'm not remembering correctly, but they were all my African friends and Maghrébin friends, they were thinking, oh man, I gotta make the bus. Because if you did not get back where you belonged, somewhere, I never even went over to where they lived, but
there's literally no place for them. They were cut off.
Right, if you were walking in the street at 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, and you were of a certain race, the police knew you had no business here.
Yeah.
And I would tell them, don't you see that this is a form of racism? And of course, my anger was minimized, a great deal. So, and still, then Le Pen comes along, and with all of his words, and the white supremacists that were coming up in those years. This was in the late 1980s that all of this was going on. So, and I know also the French are moving into New York. And I don't know if you've realized, but they've almost colonized Harlem.
Yes, I've realized.
Okay, and I've actually been told, because now my neighbors now in Harlem are Parisian, who are buying up homes in blocks and streets I never even went into as a Harlem girl.
How did they treat you in France?
Oh, in France?
Yeah. Did you have that dreamy African-American experience?
That was it. Well, I was there when the dollar was 10 francs. So it was so...
I don't even know what that means, because I came in with the euro.
With the euros, okay. Well, I don't even know what the euros are, but it was a lot of money. It doubled my money.
Oh, my God.
And so when they found out I was, American, everything was just like crazy.
Yeah.
And I definitely felt the difference of how people treated me versus how they treated my African friends. And I say African friends because I met Africans from Côte d'Ivoire and
Yeah.
Mali that I had never met here in the United
Yeah.
States.
Yeah.
So it's just an interesting experience, and very confusing, as your first slide said. It gets you up in the head,
Yes.
and you're just so tied up.
Yes.
It's hard to realize when French people are really being if they're just being disdainful, or if they're
Right.
being racist.
Right.
You know. So.
Yeah. There's so many reasons why recognizing first of all, recognizing racism is not always easy, even in context here.
Yes.
You know, but in France, there's so many reasons, and you've touched on some of them, why there's just dissimulation at every level of the society.
Yes.
And that's why, just like, I'm concerned and curious to see what happens with these commemorative movements, because they're working in a vacuum, right, of where, the history of what's happened, much less what's still happening, just gets continually denied.
Yes. And they'll tell me, oh, my sister married a black. My
Exactly.
sister married a black,
Right.
Like, it doesn't exist anymore.
Right.
And
Yeah.
yet still, if you're a black, you feel it.
Yeah.
You know it's going on. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. So we'll have time to fellowship a bit in the back. I wanted to highlight we have many more events this semester, and I hope to see you back in our space. So coming up, we have the Zora Neale Hurston lecture next Wednesday night. We will have Beth Ritchie, professor from University of Illinois at Chicago, who will give a talk, Arrested Justice, Black Feminist Reflections on Carceral Feminism and Prison Abolition. So hope to see you next week on March 9th. We have a couple other big talks with Reverend Jesse Jackson and Dr. Cornel West in conversation on March 31st, our Black Girl Movement Conference that's coming up in April, and many, many more events. So please, check the calendar, and we hope to see you in the room. Thanks again for coming to tonight's conversation.